Who longs for laurel or the myrtle trees? Philosophy, you travel nude and poor, proclaims the mob, intent on money making. The other way provides less company. So much so, gentle soul, I beg you, please, do not abandon your grand undertaking.
Well, I think there is a mystery and nostalgia. I mean, why do we look back? It's not perfectly evident that we should look back. That we should, for instance, have a memory of fireflies over farmland. That should enchant us so, and yet it does.
The Greek word mystery, mysterion or whatever, it didn't mean just a secret. It meant, a secret rite, a secret religious rite. And so the way that we think of mystery, it's something exhaustible. If we know it, then it's no longer a mystery. Um, but in the Greek sense, you can know a mystery, and it doesn't lose its enchantment there.
Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the New Lyre podcast. I'm your host, David Gosselin, and I'm here with a very talented roster of new guests. We have Michael Shindler, Michael Astrew, Sarah Ashbach, and we'll let you guys introduce yourselves as well, but I'll read just some formal introductions for people, for our viewers, if they're not familiar with all our contributors here, just to streamline it a bit. So Wikipedia says Michael James Astrew is an American lawyer and under the pen name A.M. Yuster, a poet and critic. He served as the 15th Commissioner of the Social Security Administration from 2007 to 2013. Astrew was poetry editor of First Things from 2018 to 2020 and became poetry editor of Plough Quarterly in 2020. Very nice. Sarah Ashbach is an MFA student with the University of St. Thomas and teaches at a classical Christian school in Oklahoma City. Her work has appeared in the New Lyre, Ecstasis, and the St. Austin Review, and she was the 2024 recipient of the Frost Farm Poetry Prize. Michael Shindler is a writer living in Washington, D.C. His work has been published in outlets including the American Spectator, the American Conservative, Church Life, University Bookman, North American Anglican, and New English Review. His first book, Fret Not, a short collection of poetry, was published by Finishing Line Press in late 2024. Follow him on Twitter at Michael Shindler. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you guys. So that was the formal side of things. Now we're going to have a little bit of fun. Mike, you're working on a collection, a translation of Petrarch's Canzoniere, which is
Correct.
Very cool. How's that coming along? Is it?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. So from my vantage point, it was done in June of 2022. And it was supposed to be launched contractually no later than December of 2023, but we are still working at it. So in fact, this week, I'm working with two friends on the copy editing, and our response to the copy editing just went in yesterday, and so they're now saying April, so it'll be 3 years after the latest date. So I'm not happy about that, but otherwise, it's done. It was a little bit of a surprise to me. I wasn't sure that I could do it. I tried to do it 25 years ago with a friend named Catherine Tafariello. Dana Joya sort of cornered us at the Westchester conference and talked us into it. And we made pretty good progress for about 18 months, although that still didn't get us a very big chunk of the canzoniere. And then we both kind of ran out of gas simultaneously. So the poem that you've asked me to read is actually one of the older ones in the collection that you'll see, because it goes back to the time when I was collaborating with Catherine. And I mean, this is all mine. I had mine, she had hers, and we commented on each other's, and it was a great collaboration. Wonderful poet in person. So it took me a minute to get back into it because I didn't worry about it too much. I was able to clean it up a little bit, so it stands pretty much the way it did 25 years ago.
I mean, it's an undertaking. But it's also, I think it's a good time for something like that. You know, the Petrarch, Renaissance man supreme. I just gave a 3-hour lecture actually on the Renaissance. I've been doing a lot of work on that. That's been keeping me busy. I have a book coming out on the Renaissance as well. And I feel there is a spirit of rebirth in the air when it comes to the arts, culture, and poetry. And that's part of the reason we have this podcast is, you know, there's a lot of people who feel disenchanted. There is a lot of disenchantment in the world. But I feel like if we take a good zoom out, there are so many promising things happening right now. And as our viewers will see, all our guests here are accomplished poets and have written some very fine stuff. And we're going to be getting into that. We're going to be having some fun reading some poetry. So to start us off, though, Mike, why don't you inaugurate this discussion with Petrarch's fine sonnet, which I think will set a nice tone for.
This one I was asked to read is Canzoniere 7. Let me mention a couple things for people that aren't as familiar with it as David. In line 8, Helicon is a river sacred to the Muses. Line 10 is actually a quotation. There are references to laurel, which was sacred to Apollo and used to honor people, hence our term laureate. Myrtle was sacred to Mercury and Venus. And also in line 10, the quotation, the standard interpretation is that the word philosophy is referring to Pallas Minerva, otherwise known as Athena. I'm not quite so sure about that. I think that this may be a line influenced by Boethius and lady philosophy. So I would say just keep an open mind on that.
Right.
All right, Canzoniere 7. Indulgence, sloth, and cushioned luxuries have driven virtue into banishment, where nature, vanquished by our temperament, seems dazed and lost between the boundaries. And heaven's gentle light, which oversees all human life, has now become so spent that those who want the stream's replenishment in Helicon are seen as oddities. Who longs for laurel or the myrtle trees? Philosophy, you travel nude and poor, proclaims the mob, intent on money making. The other way provides less company, so much so, gentle soul, I beg you please, do not abandon your grand undertaking.
Do not abandon your grand undertaking. This is Petrarch speaking to us, speaking to the audience right now. I'm pretty sure that's what he intended. And I think it's a fine message. You know, it opens, could you just reread us the opening lines, right? It talks about sloth and
indulgence, sloth, and cushioned luxuries have driven virtue into banishment, where nature, vanquished by our temperament, seems dazed and lost between its boundaries.
Beautiful. Perfect. And I think why I like this sonnet so much is that a lot of people are complaining about the same thing today, right? A lot of people saying the culture has become decadent, our society's become decadent, philosophy has been abandoned. But ironically, if we rewind to the Renaissance, it's the same laments, right? So some things change, some things stay the same, but I think that actually helps to situate ourselves in the current moment. And it's really an invitation, right? Which path do we want to choose? They're always open. Laurel.
It's a grittier text than I think a lot of people appreciate. There was a tradition through a lot of the 20th century to translate this as sort of courtly poetry, which it's not. You know, it's poetry that's written by a man that's struggling between his lust for a married woman and his religious ambitions. And he was a man who had taken minor orders in the church. And so the religious part of it is not inconsequential. And in the early days, the lust is winning out. And then it's part of the story. And it's not a linear progression, but as it progresses, the religious inclinations win out. And so it is a story, and it's written in a time of plague. It's written in a time of huge corruption, particularly in the Catholic Church. Every once in a while, when I want to wake an audience up, I read there's a 3-sonnet sequence in the 120s known as the Babylon sonnets, and that's basically an extended rant against the corruption in the Vatican, which had actually moved out of Rome and gone to Avignon, not very far from where Petrarch was living.
Right. Yeah, and the real story is, like you said, the poem is grittier, and the real history is always much more interesting and nuanced than, these more romanticized versions, whether it's of the Renaissance, where, people have this idea today that everything was just a beauty and philosophy and everything was going well, but it was the same struggle, right? There were the same problems, and some people like Petrarch and Renaissance humanists, I don't like that word. They didn't call themselves humanists, but we got to call them something, right? Renaissance humanists made a decision to sort of forge a new path. So yeah, I think that's food for thought. And we could go into this subject for a while, but Michael, Sarah, any thoughts so far? I mean, you guys are poets, you guys are interacting with the modern world, as we all are, but I feel like, a lot of folks have been, especially the formalist world, maybe we've been shuttered off, or it has been isolated. And so how are you guys faring?
Sure. Well, I don't mean to get. I just assumed that I should go first, but since I already am going, there's a sense in which decadence can seem like something that would smother someone. A sense in which, I don't know, in which sort of this lack of virtue, this heavy cloud of sin and depression would weigh down and um, get in the way of true creative production. But I think that we can also think of decadence as a sort of cocoon, and that from this cocoon, new things can spring. It's the sort of situation which forces people to go back into themselves and create reinvention. So I'm not so pessimistic about our current decadent age as others might be. I think that it forces us to create, it forces us to reinvent ourselves, it forces us to adapt. Certainly, it's forced me.
No, that's a much more adaptive take, I think, and probably healthier and useful. Yeah. And Sarah, you're currently teaching. You're studying for your MFA, and you're also teaching, and you're writing some great poetry. I mean, you just won a prize recently, and we have some of your poems that are going to be featured in the coming issue of New Lyre. So yeah, how are things?
Um, well, I do feel like I'm sort of wrapped up in a nice little cocoon because I teach at a classical school. And the students are immersed in poetry from the time that they can read. And then I'm studying with James Matthew Wilson and Ryan Wilson. So I do feel like I'm wrapped in a very nice cocoon over here. But I mean, I do think our age has unique problems. The lines you asked Mike to reread reminded me of this Heidegger essay from I think like 1955. He says something about how technology, it used to be um, more closely related to its Greek roots, technique, craft, but it had become something a bit more monstrous. And he says that everywhere and always man is surrounded by himself, something like that. And of course, he says that in 1955, and it's like this terrible prophecy of the age of the smartphone and social media. This age of decadence we live in, decadence of the self. But poetry is always pushing us toward the other, toward wonder at the world. That's where Aristotle tells us philosophy begins, is in wonder. Um, and poetry is always pushing us toward wonder at the other. So, although um, philosophy might be standing nude in some respects in the streets, I do think that um, she's never been forsaken, and neither has poetry. And I think that things like this show that very well.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I like what you said in terms of when we're talking about this question of mystery and enchantment and wonder. We I hear the voices, right? There are critics. A lot of the problems with the modern age is there's been a loss of mystery, right? And this has been traditionally associated with religion, spirituality, faith, naturally. So a lot of people like to lament that. But one could also argue that, as you were just pointing out, poetry is an art has played a major role in this question of mystery as well. And we know that in recent decades, or we could say a century even, there were all sorts of more experimental approaches taken to poetry. And some were much more technical. I guess they were focused more on various technical aspects at times. But yeah, poetry is about mystery. If anything, I like to think about poetry as something that clarifies the mysteries for us, right? The mysteries are never going away. The mystery of man, the mystery of soul, mystery of God, and how we commune with these things, they're not going away. And the more we actually know, whether it's through scientific investigation of the cosmos or investigation of the psyche and the self, I think if done properly, they only make the mystery clearer. And poetry is there to, in a sense, simplify that, right? And capture it in forms that are essentially friendly reminders of that. And I think good poetry always does that. And having
Right. Well, the Greek word mystery, mysterion or whatever, it didn't mean just a secret. It meant, a secret rite, a secret religious rite. And so the way that we think of mystery, it's something exhaustible. If we know it, then it's no longer a mystery. Um, but in the Greek sense, you can know a mystery and it doesn't lose its enchantment there because there's something sacred in it.
Yeah, absolutely. If anything, it's a source of rejuvenation. You can always go back to it for more, and it's inexhaustible. I'd like to think, and I mean that's the basis of. I mean, if we're talking about poetry and we're talking about creativity, I have not seen an end to creativity, right? It's not something that you can exhaust, but I feel like there were in past in past periods during the 20th century, there was like, oh, we have to do something new. What used to be done in terms of classics and classical art, it's no longer compatible with the modern world. And I feel like that was a major psycho-spiritual bind for people. They're like, ah, we're in the modern world. We love the classics, but the classics can't be or superimposed onto this artificial system that we've created, or there's a million variations on that. Michael, you wrote about that in what, or was it you, or was it Elijah actually? Oh no, it was Elijah who we discussed with last time, but he was talking about how one of the authors, I'm forgetting the name, but the argument was that there was no place for tragedy in the modern world because tragedy, the classical Greek institution of tragedy, required a certain collective, shared meaning making. And in a secular, fractured world, you don't have that. So you can't have these kind of cathartic, transformative types of art that function on a societal scale, which he disagreed with, and I would disagree with. But yeah, there have been a lot of these arguments that I think have stifled or sort of cornered people's minds, where we can't have a classical aesthetic in the modern world, or classical philosophy, right? Or what does that even mean? Is it really a period? I feel like people get confused with that, right? Some people, they like the idea of Renaissance or renewal in poetry and literature, but then there's this idea that that means somehow reproducing the past, right? Or recapturing it or imitating it. But I think, I don't know that that's true.
I don't think that it is. I think that when we talk about sort of the monster of techne and the horrors of the modern world, um, it's easy to be overawed and despair, but I think that man's at his best when he's off conquering and taming monsters. If we see society dominated by a certain like inhumanity, uh, I think it's a time to rejoice. This is a time where we have actually something to conquer. Like people who lived in sort of previous ages, they got to live in periods of great humanity. They got to live in periods where their humanity was indulged, so to speak. We, however, have the peculiar honor and privilege of living in a time where our humanity is actually in question. And to live in a point in time where humanity is in question is to be in a time where you can actually give the answer in a way that previous ages were not so disposed to. This to me is an opportunity as opposed to something to be mourned.
Wait, so are you saying that the robots will never, there will never be a Shakespeare robot?
Oh, I mean, if there's a Shakespeare robot, then it ceases to be a robot for me. I think that if we start encountering sort of robots that have the glimmer of a soul, we ought to start talking to them as friends as opposed to machines. But uh, I think that that's not the main concern. At least for me, I think that the sort of stronger concern is that we live in an age where so much of what was human is now being done by machines, or so much of what I thought of as humane processes or processes are sort of now entirely automated or commodified or given over to sort of larger abstracted conditions that rob them of their humanity. And that in response to that, we can defend humanity as such. We can sort of articulate ourselves in contrast to that. And it's in that contrast that we have the chance to do something special and new. We can talk about the value of humanity. We can show that value to others and say that even though much of our lives have been subsumed in this artificiality, that the core value of our lives is not in the artificiality. It's not in those things that are being automated, but it's in something deeper and a mystery that is going to endure, but should endure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it only highlights, okay, so robots can do certain things, but if anything, that's only an invitation to rediscover, well, what is it that humans uniquely do? And yeah, I think art here is essential, right? Culture is there to, that's where the ideas are going to come from. On that note, why don't you read us, why either Sarah or Michael, why don't you read us one of your poems here? Both of you guys deal with mystery, which I like in your poems. Your poems can be quite mysterious. So on that note, you were just railing about the the robots, well,
Mhm.
after me. So yeah, why don't you read us something, Mike, from your collection? I read a few.
Sure.
They're all very nice. Very...
Well, apologies for having it on my phone as opposed to on a nice piece of paper. In the vein of this increasingly artificial world. So the following poem is from my collection, originally published in Apocalypse Confidential. It is called "Pan is in the Wood," and of the three poems that I sent ahead, is probably the most apropos. It's also very short. Pan is in the wood, and she heard him, though he is dead. There's evil, good, and something grim life leaves unsaid in the dead god's hymn.
Reread it for us and just
Sure.
slow it down a bit as well. It's good. But so
Yeah.
yeah, for our audiences and
Mhm. Sure. Pan is in the wood, and she heard him, though he is dead. There's evil, good, and something grim life leaves unsaid in the dead god's hymn.
the dead god's hymn. There's something, I have it right here. I just want to highlight what you wrote here. But can you reread us that last line, Mike?
Last stanza or last line?
Life leaves unsaid. There's evil, good.
Oh, so there's evil, good, and something grim life leaves unsaid in the dead god's hymn.
In the dead god's hymn is the in that wasn't. They're short, and I think people will have some comments. But read us. You have like three. They're all pretty short. So give people a taste of your
Oh,
approach.
sure.
You have a pine wood, and you have between the columns. They all work together.
Sure. So to add, Between the Columns, which is published in the New English Review and is not in fret not, but will probably be or some variation of which will be in my next collection whenever it comes out. Um, Between the columns in the dark, the landscape where youth finds its way, the evocations of blue and purple and the vernal green of stagnant nature. We go chasing after something, spark, a light different than that of day, like fireflies over farmland that only memories capture. Past the columns, the colored maze, the garden and the wasted days. Past the life lived too late, the figure looking back from the gate. We go chasing.
Hmm. Mysterious. You're a mysterious man, Michael. What's
Or,
maybe people have some thoughts, but you can tell us, yeah, what's, again, this is kind of a lame question, but what's going through your head as you compose or works like that, or what prompted you?
well, I'm not sure exactly what prompted me. The problem with me and my poetry and being able to be an astute critic of my own poetry is that whenever I write in such a way that I'm not thinking about my poetry. I usually sort of write late at night, make sure to either drink enough or get tired enough or exhausted enough where I'm not thinking about what I'm writing. Because I find that whenever I think about my poetry as I write it, poetry is always awful. So if I can get thought out of mind and just let my unconscious sort of speak, then I have something going. The problem is that when I look back at it, I have to sort of guess, like any other critic, and say, "Well, I wonder what I was talking about there."
Yeah.
And half the time I don't know, but as long as it's good, I publish it. Um, in this one, I think that there's something in nostalgia that we recognize that we don't always recognize in the moment. Sometimes you have a memory of something in your deep past, something sort of glorious, something wonderful, something that you identify as an adult looking back into your childhood that as a child, maybe you saw and recognized, maybe you didn't, but that is certainly far more evident, sparkling, glimmering in the window of memory. And once we identify that in the window of memory, we go chasing after it. Although it's hard to chase after in a present sense because you can't see it nearly as clearly. So you constantly have to use memory as a lens refracted back into the present in order to chase after that thing, which is never as clear until it's already over. So it is I don't know, it's a poem about one of those drives in life where one chases after a thing one can't see clearly and yet is of the utmost importance. Of this thing that will glimmer, that will hold a glimmer, that will ultimately ground and give value to one's life.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's there's a almost a, because you're talking about childhood, so there's almost like a mystical Wordsworthian quality to your stuff, right? It's
Mm.
childhood, but things are a bit more mystical, um, as opposed to just purely nostalgic or romanticized, which is,
Well, I think there is a mystery and nostalgia. I mean, why do we look back? It's not it's not perfectly evident that we should look back. That we should, for instance, have a memory of fireflies over farmland. That should enchant us so, and yet it does. There's something in the fact that we do reminisce that is mysterious. Like it's not obvious to me that all creatures reminisce. Like I'm not sure that a dog or a bear looks back on his childhood in the way that we do. Um, this is I'm putting aside the question of dog and bear intelligence, but I think that there's something about the way we live that requires nostalgia and memory to inform it.
yeah, but more
Okay.
than just muscle memory, at least, right? I'm sure the bear, mama bear's got, muscle memory, and she kind of knows what to do if danger happens. She doesn't really have to think about it. Same way if, I'm riding my bike here in Montreal and car door opens, like before my mind can process it, the automatic systems kick in and it's stop or die. So yeah, there's a higher kind of memory, I guess you could say, or some kind of transcendental quality of memory, because it's not just that memory of the past is not just of the past, and that past is not, it's also in the present, and it shapes the present and it shapes the future. So memory is a rather elusive thing when we really get into it. So your poetry seems to explore that in interesting ways.
In memory, Mnemosyne, memory is the mother of the muses.
That's very, yeah, good thing not to forget. Sarah, read us something cool. You have so many cool poems. Read us one of your cool poems.
I'm glad you think that. It's sort of related, I guess, to what Michael just read. So I'll read Cult of the Dying God, which I think you enjoyed too, David. I'm also reading it off my computer on a screen. It's very terrible, I know. This is Cult of the Dying God. I've seen the wild girls dancing in the trees in February, just as memories of sense begin to creep into the roots of elms and oaks, and in the snowdrop shoots nodding their heads above the melting frost. Have you seen them? The ones who count up lost things of a year, the holly berries flung into the rimy snow to rot among wet autumn leaves, old antlers shed beside a low creek bank where hungry foxes hide, the scatterings of red-flecked feathers left by doves. Those girls accepted autumn's theft of the maturing wood's green gladness when the year turned fallow. But they now began to cultivate their revels that will bring the long-expectant wood its promised spring. And have you seen their ivy-winding staves tipped with a pine cone? Each girl laughs and waves her staff to wake the trees. Their god delights to see a place for spring's exacting rites. Have you seen them? The ones who testify in ecstasy of spring why spring must die. I've seen the robin stalk the soil for worms, as gurgling from the thawed creek reaffirms an intuition stirring through the wood. The early rising elm has understood. It puts out flowers and red samara seeds, till sleepily the bee-roused oak concedes the morning hour of the year has come. And then the vernal god will soon succumb to spring's dissevering beauty. I wondered why he should submit to die, until nearby I heard the mad one singing. He will descend into the earth to be consumed, to tend each elm and oak, and each round whirring bee with riven fragments of eternity. And we will savagely sustain our trust in death's significance, as all things must. I hear that song now, hear their revelries. Do you hear them, the mad girls in the trees?
Fascinating. There's a lot going on in that poem. It's really fun.
Yeah, I do like the picture of the wild girls dancing in the trees, the mad girls. It's particularly evocative. It's the sort of thing I'd like to see in trees. And instead, I just see birds. I'm actually looking at my window right now, and all I've got are sort of gray doves prancing around, and they're not the best sight. I wonder, Sarah, what's sort of your what prompted that picture that you drew of the mad girls in the trees?
Well, I was working with the idea of the Maenads or the Bacchae, this sort of Dionysian revel in the woods, and um, Oklahoma in spring is not exactly tame. We uh, see a bit more of the violence of the earth here than I think most people see in their day-to-day lives. Um, and Growing up in the South, particularly where people hunt, you tend to see a lot of dead things in the spring. Um, Man and beast and the earth all violent and wild together. But there's something life-giving in that too, which is strange and mysterious, I think.
The Cult of the Dying God. The title is also Very provocative. Mm, there's a lot. I mean, we could go into that for a while. I do think it's one thing that stands out for me though is often it's very common for nature to be romanticized or idealized, but as you pointed out, in Oklahoma, but it's not just in Oklahoma, it's in a lot of places actually. Nature can actually be pretty violent, right? It's not all just babbling streams and rainbows. And that exploring that opens up a whole different terrain poetically. And yeah, I think that's useful because romanticism has a place, but it seems that it can also limit people. And I feel a lot of the black pilling, as the young folks say today, and the cynicism has a lot to do with a kind of romanticized ideal of the past. There was this perfect, great past, everything was pure, and today things are fallen or into a web of technological, demon haunted technology and all that. But yeah, so it's interesting. You're kind of approaching the theme in a less romantic way, in a more interesting way. I think that's useful. We've been going on for Mike. Any thoughts on Michael, Sarah?
Nothing revelatory. I'm thinking a little bit about nature and my own work and the work of others, and I think it does sort of split. I think that a lot of poets are drawn toward a romanticized view and the romanticized view that they can somehow get in touch with nature in an unmediated way. I think for me, nature, I think it's my view of nature is, I guess, a very suburban view of nature. I don't, I'm not out there sort of embracing redwoods and things like that. And I think that for me, the scenes of nature are usually valued because somehow they make you reflect upon human society. And one thing I've noticed just recently about my own work, I've got enough now that I'm starting to see a pattern sort of here and there. I lost interest I guess when we moved up to Massachusetts when I was 8, but when I was younger than I was fascinated by birds, and I had this couple books about birds that my parents had given me, and I knew a lot more about birds when I was 7 than I do today. But somehow I noticed, I was putting together the next collection of poetry, and like a lot of birds in these poems. And so I think in some ways, I haven't advanced, in 60 years. I'm still sort of fixated on the birds, but I think it's in a different way. I think it makes me think about myself and human society in lots of ways. So not a bad thing.
No, absolutely. I feel like I sound eccentric when I say this, but I like modern civilization, right? If we look at any great, a lot of the peaks in civilization, they're not really happening in a forest. There's all sorts of sketchy things happening in the forest and in those periods as well. But you think of Baghdad, you think of Florence, you think of these Athens, and so yeah, I think civilization is good and is also mysterious and enchanting when people are not sort of the brains are not oversaturated with information, and there's discernment, right? There's a love of philosophy. The other stuff tends to take care of itself, but naturally, if there isn't philosophy, if there isn't this hunger and desire for beauty that's kindled or awakened or just fed, right? And people are instead fed all sorts of weird things, just to keep it simple, then yes, modern civilization seems to be overly complex, but a lot of the best stuff comes out of some kind of civilizational thrust and an optimism, right? Or a vision, which at a certain point, if it's going to really be realized, you need some kind of, whether it's a city state or a broader civilization or empire, the best stuff usually emerges in that context. It's not at a, bacchanal in, a desolate forest. There's usually more happening, at least for my take. So I don't know that I'm suburban about it, but I also think that it's important to rediscover the mystery of modern civilization. And that has a lot of poetry in it too, has a lot of possibilities.
On that note, if I could add something about I suppose the contrast between nature and civilized society, and the way in which nature seems to be at odds. I'm not sure that when romantic poets go to nature in their poetry, for instance, myself, um, that what we're going to is sort of nature per se, like nature as it really is. Like, certainly, I like nature. When I was a kid, I had a big sort of forest in my backyard. I used to prance around in it and really enjoy it and get lost for hours. And it was wonderful. But when I refer to nature in my poetry today, I find that what I keep on sort of referring to and the sort of world that's built up that gets glossed as the natural is something more like the unconscious. Uh, in my experience, the nature, the trees, the flowers, the moonlight, the stars, etc., that I sketch out exist almost in a basically sort of like a Jungian forest of archetypes more than any real forest in the world. So that when I refer to nature, despite living in the middle of Washington D.C., what I'm referring to is sort of this area of unconscious retreat that civilized people go into that maybe has very little relation to the natural realm. Certainly, the nature in my poetry does. In fact, I remember when I wrote my first short story, Mother's Home, that somebody who's reading it told me, "Hey, this doesn't make sense. This can't be real." And I asked why, and he pointed to a certain line where I talk about the moonlight and the stars, and he says, "Michael, when the moon's out, you can't see the stars." And obviously, that's true. But the sort of picture of nature that I was referring to, this sort of unconscious, like a Midsummer Night's Dream scape, of course, had a shining moon, shining stars, and resplendent, shimmering flowers. So I think that when poets talk about nature, it's not in contrast to civilized life, but refers to an interiority to civilized life, which we put into natural terms because those are terms that we have from our childhood already within us, and that it's just somewhere we can point to. Like, in fact, for somebody who is living in real nature, they might point in their poetry maybe to a city of the mind, or something like to that effect. I think that is just sort of a contrast that we can draw to point out a sense of to gesture at interiority.
No, for sure. Yeah, I mean, nature gets transfigured at a certain point or in some way, which I think, yeah, is definitely useful. And on that note here, we're going to introduce an outside poet here who's not present today. I'll read a poem by a very talented Stuart Burke, who is a very learned man, a retired spook of sorts, who writes very fascinating stuff. And he engages with tradition in very compelling ways. So we're switching the focus only slightly from nature to time. So this one is called Care is the Thief of Time. Hope is imminent, like wine in an ewer, but care is the thief of time. Love is infinite, but time is not. Care is the thief of time. When the tiger roars, wind rises. When the dragon stirs, clouds gather. When the crow soars, the end is near. Care is the thief of time. The thief must vanish by day to ply her trade, ghost-like, at night. She's one to lavish her hands with care, is the thief. Of time, as much as she can hold in 10 fingers, she has. But time is a liquid gold, alas, and care is the thief of time. What can be purloined can be hid in the folds of space, but never rejoin to its past, for care is the thief of time. While the moon gleams, we seek a respite from worry, but even in our dreams, we risk a scare. It is the thief of time, with her ill-gotten gains, a miser to hold moments so dear. Has she ever forgotten even a single minute? If care is the thief of time, from whose vest pocket was time snatched? Time's priceless locket was in whose care? Is the thief of time the spurned lover of time's protector? Did she take back something another took? In whose gentle care is the thief of time? Oh, time's thief must be lonely in her timelessness. Her heart's grief must be a bottomless care, is the thief's. Of time she has too much, and the rest of us too little, for she has become time itself. Such love as she needed was lost. Now care is the thief of time. It's a ghazal playing with a beautiful paradox here. Do we care too much, too little? Are we robbed of our time by caring? Or does caring take time? And I just love how it's very musical naturally as a ghazal, but also in its thematic development, right? There's a lot of repetition here, and yet it's never tiresome. It's just advancing the theme and introducing new paradoxes. So I really like that one. And Stuart's very good. He mentioned how when he writes a poem, he does strive for some element of surprise. And his argument, I feel like, or in recent times, there was this whole idea, at least with some contemporary poetry or deconstructionist poetry, that a poem shouldn't give some kind of closure, right? There shouldn't be some kind of punchline, or because life's not like that, so why should the poem be like that? And there's a whole philosophy. But Stuart just said that, he aims for some kind of surprise, to at least to surprise himself, because he said, once you've lived for a while, a lot of things become familiar. And so what always stands out are those things in life that can surprise you, that can arrest your attention and maybe invite further reflection. And so I feel he does that very beautifully in this poem, which is going to be featured along with many others in the coming new Lyre issue. Did you guys like it?
I would have told him that I think that he could improve it by sticking a lot closer to the form of the traditional ghazal, because he's got so much variation. It's almost over the line to even call this a ghazal. And maybe that would, if he'd gotten away from calling it a ghazal, maybe that would have freed him up in some other ways. But typically in a traditional ghazal, you'd have the same number of syllables in every line, and he varies from 9 to 18. You don't simply just repeat a phrase. You have, particularly one as long as this, you have a shorter phrase or word at the end, and then you've got a rhyming word that goes, I think it's called the kafiya, that goes before the phrase, and that creates a certain amount of suspense. It can create humor. I mean, the ghazal is both a mystical form and a form for humor, originally. And then at the end, there's in the final couplet, usually you have some sort of appeal to God, often in sort of an indirect and clever reference, and then usually even more cleverly, you have your name or a nom de plume or some self-reference buried into that at the end. So for people who love the form, as I do, you're looking for all those things that aren't here in this. And so the interesting question for him is, okay, you've got a good start. You've said what you wanted to say. Does it bring out more, or does it to try to, conform with the historical guidelines, or does that take away from what you're really trying to do? And so I would say to him, I would at least try to do it, more traditionally, and see whether that brings out things that you weren't consciously looking for.
I think that's good, and I like the initiative, right? So yeah, this is interesting to say. Wow, every poem's amazing, and everything's perfect, right? We don't want that either. I think part of the moment in which we're in is, we want to see the best possible poetry and art and flourishing of creativity. And so if we're guided by a love of wisdom, right, we started with the question of philosophy, then finding ways to improve ourselves, our work is good, right? And it's exciting. And when you actually have a dialogue where we have people that can engage at that level, arguably that's one of the things that, when you don't have that, if things are too siloed and you don't have some kind of salon culture, right? Like, it would be nice if it wasn't just all emails, but that creates a very nonlinear process. So that's good. And no, I agree, Mike, and as well, for myself, I was translating, I just recently put out a translation of Schiller's Cranes of Ibycus, which I worked on for like 5 weeks. Like every day I would go at it a bit because it's 23 stanzas, ottava rime, and it's at first for translation, because I've done a lot of translation, I'm always trying to balance. I don't want to make the poem feel contrived. I want it to really read as its own authentic poem, and yet I still want to stay as close as possible to the original. You have to take some liberties, right? You need discernment there. But so sometimes the meter was a bit looser than it could be. And I had written to Dana Joy, and I was like, hey, I feel like I'm not fully capturing the drama here. Like, I know it's there. And he just said, well, if you just tighten up the meter a bit, you're probably going to find a lot of it is going to come out naturally. And so I tightened it up more than often I had the tendency to do. And it worked, right? Just by sort of allowing for the drama to really develop in a metered and measured way, it brought out certain contrasts and tensions, and it was doable. It just took time. It just took more time. I was just like, wow, this is how much, I don't have, the Carnegies are not financing my translations, so like, how much time can I afford to put into this 23 stanza poem? It was more that. But I said, this is a big poem. It's an important poem. And, there's a whole essay for it. So I just went at it, and it worked. So I agree that, this craft thing, sometimes there's always this tension between traditionalism and modernism, which I don't think is bad. But sometimes is it okay to lean more one way or the other? And sometimes yes, sometimes no. And it requires a certain artfulness, right, to discern. But oftentimes getting the craft down to that and the form down, a lot of the magic happens on its own if we can actually get there. So
and you're right, it takes a lot of time. I mean, I'm in one sense fortunate now in that I was forcibly retired by 2 autoimmune diseases, so I've got a lot of time to be able to spend on particularly the translations. And with what I was doing before, since I'm not an academic, and I had jobs I really enjoyed, now I could not have. I mean, I tried to do the Petrarch when I was working, and I couldn't, and then was able to pull it off later. And in fact, in some bizarre way, it was helpful that it was my pandemic project, because I was kind of sealed off not going anywhere anyway.
Right.
And so it helped to discipline me to spend the hard effort and the huge amount of time it takes to get translating great formal poetry into some sort of reasonable, facsimile. And it's not easy. It does take a lot of time.
Yeah, that's really it, and dedication. So, well, hats off. Thank you, Michael, for that 25-year journey, right, to this canzoniere. And on that note, why don't you read us another one? I think we're due for another Petrarch on it.
Why don't I try one I haven't read before? Make it an adventure.
Sure.
So this is 49. But I've kept you from dishonest scheming, despite the great respect I always pay. Ungrateful tongue, you still do not convey one shred of honor, only shame and screaming. Since the more I need your help redeeming through your mercy, the more cold you stay. And if there are some words you have to say, they're halting and like those of someone dreaming. Sad tears each evening you keep joining me, when isolation is my sole relief. Then when my calm is coming, you depart. And sighs, you're so prepared to give me grief and anguish, then meander haltingly. My eyes alone can speak about my heart.
Beautiful. Petrarch, what's interesting is, I mean, and I think it's also, you can maybe say a few things that you've learned about Petrarch, the man, and his thought processes throughout your journey here. But I feel that there are a lot of different kinds of sonnets, right, in the canzoniere. He wrote this, it technically compiles sonnets written across a period of how long?
About 30 years. And most of them, so there are a little over 300 sonnets, about 310, I think, if I remember correctly. And then there are balladas and experimental forms. And I mean, some of those experimental forms are really wild, and a couple of those poems are really nuts. But to use a technical term. There are about 8 of the sonnets, if I remember correctly, that are not Petrarchan sonnets in the Petrarchan form. I mean, they're Petrarchan in that Petrarch wrote them, but they don't actually follow what's become to known as the Petrarchan sonnet form. So it is a reminder that he was an innovator, and people tend to forget the biggest innovation, which is that he was writing in the vernacular at the time when that was a very radical thing to be doing. And Dante had done it a little bit before him, and Chaucer was doing it in England. And it is one of the great moments in European literature where the Latin poetry had exhausted itself to some extent. And there was this great revitalization of poetry by going into the vernacular, and poets feeling that they could say things in the vernacular that they couldn't say in the Latin, in part just, I hate to rely on Harold Bloom, who was one of my professors, but, the anxiety of influence, you had Virgil and Horace and all the great Roman poets hanging over their heads. I think they felt when they were out, a little bit more out from under the shadow of those great Latin poets, that they could be more inventive and they could do things both technically and substantively that they couldn't do when writing within the Latin tradition. And most poets in that time period were hedging their bets. Dante and Petrarch were desperate to be famous. It's kind of unappealing in Petrarch from time to time, kind of the ego associated with it. But that hedging continued for a long time. I mean, certainly even as John Milton was writing more in Latin early in his career, and Milton at a very, very early age decided he wanted to be a great poet. But he was unsure, really, I think, into his 20s, mid-20s, whether that meant writing in English or writing in Latin. At some point, he finally committed to writing in English, but in the early 17th century, it wasn't clear even then what was the way to go. So he's more experimental, I think, than people realize. Usually not innovating on his own, but taking something from somewhere else and expanding on it, popularizing it, that type of thing. I think a lot of the translations in the scholarly works miss the Latinity of Petrarch. Petrarch was a great Latin scholar and Latin poet. And the Italian of the 14th century was not as far away from the Latin as it is today. And there are conventions of Latin poetry that I think Petrarch incorporated into the Italian that generally are missed by translators that are familiar with contemporary Italian. So the translation that's coming will take some questioning, maybe even some heat, because some of that Latinity affects the translation. And as I said, I think the big thing coming out of there was a wonderful man who was still a president at Yale when I was there in the 1970s, named Thomas Bergen, who was probably the most famous Petrarch scholar. He's the one that popularized a lot of Petrarch in the United States by pulling together an endless number of anthologies. Nobody was pulling off a rhymed and metered translation, so he was pulling from a lot of different sources. But he was very much of the view that this was courtly love poetry, that this was kind of an act that Petrarch was going through, the way that there were, poets before Petrarch engaging in that kind of act. And I think it just misses so much about what's going on in Petrarch, particularly, the great religious struggle. And there's a tendency from the academics to downplay the religious aspects of the poem, and also to downplay the lustier aspects of the poem. And so, I don't think that this translation is immediately going to be universally embraced. And I think that the move away from courtly, the move toward Latinity, the acceptance of the religious aspects and the erotic aspects of it, are all a little different from what we've usually seen before. Not every translation in every way, but my guess is I'm going to be taking some heat, and that's fine. I don't have a tenure committee. I don't have a department chairman to worry about, that kind of thing. I can do it the way that I think it needs to be done, and so that's what I've done.
Amen. And there's so much that could be said on that, and some people may want to chime in, but just the fact that you're just making the point here that we're in 2025, and yet Petrarch in English is still something that is still number one. How the approach that's taken can be a contentious issue, and I've experienced that myself as well in terms of what decisions do you have to make as a translator. Certain people different people will receive it well, others will not, because they have a different vision of what should be happening with translation. Some people just want to strictly keep the exact same meter, and you end up getting something very contrived. Other people believe that it's necessary. Shelley made the point, if you're going to translate a poem from one language to the target language, you have to create a new poem, essentially. You have to be a poet about it. So you do have to take some liberties. And so some people will quibble, some will quarrel, some will throw a fit. It depends. But you're dealing with two different language cultures as well. And the vernaculars are different. You can't recapture everything. So as a translator, what are the executive decisions that you're going to make in order to reproduce? For me, it's recapturing the magic of the original and being as truthful as possible in doing that. The poems have a punchline, they have ironies, and there's a certain tension around certain ideas. So that needs to be captured. And if it's reproduced with certain slight alterations in the images or the ornamentation, I think that's okay. Even if it's not literally, if you're capturing the magic and the irony and the beauty, that's more central to me. as far as
It's interesting that, with Petrarch translation, the dominant translation was one I first read in college, which is the Robert Durling translation. And it's unusual that it would be so dominant in the poetry because it's a literal translation. I mean, it's a grindingly literal translation, very hard, certainly not something that you read for pleasure. And it's very good at what it does. I mean, it's a monument of scholarship, but it's also one of the things I learned as I got further into this project. It's not perfect either. I mean, the lack of poets. I mean, he has a philologist perspective on things, not a poet's perspective. And I think, philologists tend to be very reluctant to move off the most common definition of the word. And often that's not where the poetry is. That's not, I'm persuaded, where Petrarch thought the poetry was. And so there'll be argument, but I think in some cases, Durling actually just gets it wrong because of the philologist's tendency to use the most common, definitions and not really looking at it as a text just to be analyzed in a scientific way, as opposed to looking at it as a piece of poetry. The Musa is very similar. It's in kind of loose, like verse, so it's a move toward. Yeah, it's moved toward poetry. It's a little light on music, but it's still a very accurate translation. And where it's inaccurate, it's made the same, in my view, the same mistakes that Durling made. Again, for a text that I'm trying to remember, it's almost 8,000 lines. There are probably a dozen places where I think they got it wrong. But if you look at all the other translations, and there are quite a few, even though none of them have constrained themselves in the way that I have, which is to try to very closely replicate the meter and exact rhyme. I think I've got the Italian more accurate than any of them. And I think that, we live in an era, particularly, a lot of these translations are 20, 30 years old, where, again, the Harold Bloom view that the text is almost like a trampoline for the translator to show how smart he is. There's a lot of liberties with the translations that are out there. So my view is that except for the Musa and Durling translations, my translation will be closer to the Italian than to all the others that are out there. And we'll see whether other people think that when the reviews come out. But, that was certainly my goal, was to, limit as much as possible the trade-offs to get meter and rhyme. And of course, there are times, particularly, Catherine Tafariel and I used to talk about the fourth rhyme problem. You need to come up with, a group of 4 rhymes, right, typically twice for every poem. And, we got to the point, you look at a draft and, you could tell which was the last one that was squeezed in with difficulty and awkwardness. And so part of the goal, having had time that neither Catherine or I had in 1999 when we had jobs and we were raising families and things like that, trapped away without children during the pandemic, I could spend all day on a couple lines. And if I felt like I hadn't hit it right, I could rip it out and I could start all over again. And that's one of the hardest things to do, is to rip out some of the lines that you love, because you can't hit all 4 rhymes in the way that you want to do it. And I got more comfortable doing that. The first couple of times you do it, you just you feel like you're hurting your children or something. But it's you shouldn't feel that way. And so I think in a weird way, the pandemic was a blessing for me, because it made me sit in my office where I am right now and focus on it and really do nothing else until I was really, really satisfied that I'd gotten it right.
Right. Yeah, no, and thank God there are some people that are committed to it. And hey, yeah, we're in 2025 and there's still work to be done. Like Dana Joy, he translated Seneca's The Madness of Hercules. I was just recently found out that Seneca wrote tragedies. You know what I mean? And it turns out that he has a bunch of these tragedies. And I bought a book of translations of the translated tragedies. I forget from what year. I read a bit, and it's like it needs some work, right? Like I don't know that I get wary after. It's like I don't know that I'm going to get the real poet. I want to at least know what happens, but it's like there's still so much to be translated, and that's important, I think, in terms of renewal, rejuvenation, right? The translations are, it's like discovering an ancient relic, right? And now you've sort of dusted it off, and maybe now you know what it was actually used for. Before you didn't. Like you find out something new about what was that, the Antikytherian device or whatever it's called there, that they're not
Oh yeah, the astrological clock.
Yeah, like that's the perfect sort of metaphor, right? When you find something like that and you're like, whoa, I feel like there are still a good number of works that require a good translation, and that's going to kindle a lot of enthusiasm when people are.
Amen to that. I mean, one of the things that's so bizarre to me is the enormous amount of effort that goes into translating the same, like, three poets. And again, Rilke and Baudelaire are wonderful. I cut my teeth translating them, and it was good practice. But even within that, I took a crack at some of Rilke's French poems, and finally some of my friends who are French translators taught me out of publishing them, and I think they were probably right. But he wrote 300 poems in France that have only been, for the most part, translated by one person. And they're pretty workmanlike, and so I think they don't feel terribly Rilkean, as you read those translations. So even in the most translated poet, there's still sort of work to be done. But in world literature, there's an enormous amount of fascinating stuff that hasn't been translated, and it's tough to get that published, and it's tough to build an audience on it. I mean, I translated with academic presses to pretty obscure Latin texts, and actually had to do commentaries for them. I mean, once I was doing the detailed notes to ratchet it up just a little bit more to call it a commentary was not a big jump. And I think I did those things well. I think they're important, particularly Oldham. It got the riddle going as a genre. Helped to get medieval mystical poetry going, and arguably wrote the first European poem in accentual meter and rhyme. And so, I mean, an important figure that's kind of totally overlooked. And a lot of it is the bias of the classics departments. And one of the things that's very frustrating to me is that the American classics departments have imported, the 19th and early 20th century bias of the British classical, which is, they're virulently anti-Catholic. And so basically they decided that Latin literature stopped when it became Christian. And that's why, the last poets that most people are familiar with in Christian are the ones from about 100 AD. So they've heard of Seneca, they've heard of Juvenal and others in that time period. But, you get a group of poets together and you say, okay, who are some of the poets that you like between 100 AD and 1200 AD? And, they might come up with a few Old English poems, but they're not likely to come up with any of the Latin literature, maybe Boethius. But that would be about it for most. And, there's a lot of horrible stuff. I mean, in searching for the good stuff, I've read some dreadful stuff, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff that remains to be translated. And then in Neo-Latin, I mean, Latin continued to be the literature of Europe for, well into the 17th century. And there were poets that were very popular in translation in English for a while, like Sarbusky, who they, used to call the Polish Horace. And nobody knows who he is anymore. And so they're wonderful poets out there. The poets are important historically, and it's a frustration that to me the classics departments don't encourage professors and graduate students to go out and do some really path-breaking work in that area instead of doing, the 100th, article on some couple lines of Horace or Catullus or that kind of stuff. So, you're right. There's a ton of interesting stuff out there, and I would really encourage anybody who's listening to this to go out and try to find some of it and work on it.
Absolutely. Hey, I started learning Arabic. I studied Arabic for several years. I need to get back to it so that I could translate original classical poems into English, because all the translations that I found, a lot of them, that's not true, not all, there are some great ones. Cola Franzen has a beautiful collection of Moorish poetry from Andalusia. Some of the most amazing stuff I've ever read, some of the most enchanting. And I was led to it after reading Washington Irving's Tales of Alhambra, which is also very enchanting, very magical. It's everything I sort of imagined when I think of the most fairy tale like literature in the best way. He really pulls it off, and so he brought my attention to that. So yeah, once you get into the East as well, this stuff goes on for a while. Goethe was so inspired, right, by what he discovered in Hafitz and others that gave new life to his own poetic endeavors as well. And I feel like you could reproduce that same kind of effect many times over today. And yeah, it's not just confined to the academy. That's one of the good things about
it's more open to what I like to refer to myself as a dangerous amateur. It's more open to dangerous amateurs than it's ever been because of the technology. And sometimes people get intimidated and say, well, I'm not fluent in X language, so I can't translate it. And that really shouldn't be a barrier. I think if you can access the original, then that's enough to be able to translate well. And there are tools now that can compensate for lack of fluency. So for instance, in Latin, you can punch up databases. So for Oldham, for instance, and if you're interested in a particular word, you can push a button and you can see every place that word has been used in Latin poetry. And there's several databases that will do that for you. You can find references. When I first started doing this, before you had a lot of information on the internet, it was really painful trying to figure out what a lot of these lines meant. And right. It is so much easier, with the internet. So, I'm not a big fan of translating in any volume languages that you can't access to some extent. But if you can do it to some extent, then I think it's okay. And you can get in there and you can also talk to others who are more fluent on things that are more technical. And I've started actually for the books hiring editors, poet translators who are fluent in the language to read through it and maybe catch some nuances that I might miss. Right. So I've used, for the Petrarch, I use Mara Egan, and I'm working on Propertius now, and I'm using Victoria Mall for that, and that's a great help. But if I had to, I could do it without them. Part of it is that the academic presses aren't doing peer review anymore, and that used to be a way of compensating, picking up, some things that maybe you've overlooked. You can't count on academic presses to do that anymore. Unfortunately. And so I think if you can afford to do it, and fortunately, a lot of these people work at a very reasonable price. They're my friends. I'm sorry that they're available for, fairly reasonable price. But you can do that, and you can compensate for, whatever limitations you have, language. People sometimes give me way too much credit, and I like to say, no, I'm kind of mediocre in about 6 languages. I'm not terrific in any of them.
To add a note, like I would also say that I'm perfectly like mediocre in all languages that I translate out of. Whenever I go to the countries that speak those languages and try to speak myself, the young people just laugh at me because I'm speaking this horribly affected and stilted poetic like language that has no connection with everyday speech. But in terms of what I do myself to sort of check my linguistic like mediocrity is actually something similar. So instead of hiring or of like asking friends who are more fluent, which I do sometimes, I've found, I'm not sure if this is good or bad, but what I'll often do is I'll just paste my translation into like Chat GPT with the original and just give it a prompt to say, pretend that you're fluent and given like language and giving me a harsh criticism. And I've often found that while it doesn't usually tell me anything I don't know, sometimes it does. Particularly David in the translation of the Stag Il Cervo that is in the Chain Muse. It gave me some very useful commentary on the relation of Derby to Ike D'Annunzio's use of the name of the city. I wasn't quite sure sort of like where it fit until it was able to point out like, oh hey, like he probably means something like this, and it was just useful. So I would say to young poets who maybe don't have the resources yet to hire like fluent editors or critics that there are resources online where you can just sort of paste your translation in and ask the computer to throw a criticism at you.
Well, the other option is to do what I did and marry up. So I married a college classmate who had a degree in linguistics and really is fluent in a bunch of languages, and we do. She doesn't read most of what I do, but we do talk about some of it. And she's credited in one of the footnotes in the Petrarch because I was talking about, I was confused about a Laura hairnet of some type. I think the word at least seemed to translate vaguely as net to me. And she looked at me, oh, that's a snood. And I said, what? Are you pulling my leg? I've never heard of a snood. And it turned out, I actually checked it, to places. Sure enough, it's probably a reference to a snood. So she got a credit in one of the footnotes, but she's helped out with lots of other things as well. Pardon?
What's a snood?
A snood is a sort of a medieval sort of headdress that I think that there are still snoods out there in some parts.
Like Orthodox Jews still wear snoods. Like I have lots of like aunts who have snoods.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I see what it is. Yeah. Interesting. No, absolutely. And the other one I was just going to add is translations an invitation to make some new friends. There's people who are passionate about literature in their languages. So German friends, Arabic friends, and yeah, you get a dialogue going. So it's a whole, and that's probably the best way. I was speaking with Kevin Blankenship, who teaches Arabic and does translation. We interviewed him. He'll be coming back on the show. And he was talking about the supply chain in terms of, you have the academic translations, which he made the point that if you're translating something, there needs to be precision so that the person knows what they're actually reading. So there is a reason to have that kind of literal transliteration. And then you work with somebody who maybe adds a literary or poetic dimension to it. And that out of that process is most likely for the best translation to emerge. So yeah, there's collaboration, and if we're all excited about seeing great poetry thrive, it's just win-win, all across the board as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, it's fun. Make some German friends, folks. Make some Latin friends if you can, some Italian friends.
They're all online. You got to be careful about copyright and things like that, and publication that then will screw up
right
publication journals and books later. But they're big internet communities out there, and there was a point in time where, particularly for people with formal poetry, Erratosphere was an enormously helpful place. It's had its issues and kind of hollowed out, but there are there are pockets, here or there. And I have a pretty big Twitter timeline at AM Juster, if you're interested, in about 7,500 people. And so I don't post work in progress, but I will often approach people that I'm interacting with, and they'll ask me to help them on something, and I'll ask, them for help on things, from time to time. So social media can also be helpful. I mean, in general, the technology has fouled up many things in our world, but I think in general, it's helped literary translation and made it easier to do good translation.
A line I had knocking around in my head was that without beauty, the will of man can never be tamed. Beauty is not just some nice ornamental thing, but it also has the aesthetic and the moral are kind of intertwined. If you want to elevate and educate emotions, beauty is absolutely necessary. I would say the same for technology. If for technology to be tamed, you need beauty, right? And it has to be used to create beautiful things, whether it's new Renaissance cities, beautiful Art Deco nuplex cities. I'm all for the frontier science cities as well. And beauty will be instrumental in all these things, as far as I'm concerned. I have a short story that I'm still meaning to write that I've had for a while called Little Forests on Mars. And so it's just little budding forests, and there's a budding civilization. People, their sister civilization back on Earth, most of the folks went crazy thinking, they were going to be invaded by aliens or something. Some people got away. They started their own civilization. They have a different approach to education. They have a different aesthetic, but it's no less beautiful or timeless than some of the best stuff you'll find on Earth. It has its own character. But I think anytime we're thinking about building a good future, beauty is going to play a very important role. And it's the thing that's going to get people excited and enthusiastic about participating in something that they may not see come to full fruition in their lifetime, right? So there has to be a visceral relationship to beauty and the good, and the sense that we can all partake in that. So yeah, without beauty, I think these are all, nearly impossible. But time and time again, history has shown that beauty has awakened a spirit in people that seem to, defy all odds. And I think it's no different today, right? The same universals apply, and you just need to be creative about it. So yeah, there are a lot of flanks in terms of whether it's translation, whether it's how these online or virtual poetry institutions morph into, actual festivals and events and performances. There's really, I watch Tim Dillon. He's one of my favorite podcasters, and he was just talking about, the death of Hollywood, and that it's almost like a ghost town. And he was talking to these young Harvard kids who are still like, well, what do you mean? They were asking why he wasn't in LA, and they're like, that's like the center of entertainment and stuff. He's like, not anymore, not really. Things are changing. Movies are kind of dead. And I'm not cynical in that sense, but okay, maybe people are going to be more excited about going back to theaters, going back to see live performances, dramas. In the last conversation, we were talking about verse dramas and how those would also be appropriate for films. So there's all sorts of potential, right? If people have a clear notion of beauty, it brings to life all sorts of things. Just a little reflection. So, we could go on for a while, but Sarah, do you have a poem for us? Dreamt in your philosophy. I like that one. I wouldn't mind hearing that one. And
Yeah, sure. Let me pull it up. Okay. This is Dreamt in Your Philosophy. There's a little subheading, Oklahoma Baptist University 2021. Excuse me. That's where I did my undergrad at OBU. No, it went away. Come back. There we go. A Sunday night, I cannot sleep and count the shadows in my dorm. Sorry. I was reading to my students yesterday and my voice hasn't quite recovered yet. We read Leaf by Niggle and 2 hours of that was a lot.
did they like it?
Oh yeah, they loved it. Yeah. I mean, how can you not? Okay, let me try that again. Dreamt in Your Philosophy, Oklahoma Baptist University, 2021. A Sunday night, I cannot sleep and count the shadows in my dorm. I blink up at my fairy lights, bleary. They grow like nearing stars, almost as pretty as a dream of mortal men who glimpse the Grail. My English courses trace the Grail. Poets and knights who could not sleep, confounded by a lovely dream. The poet's feet trail in my dorm. I dimly know their themes, like stars who rupture time through long dead lights. My window grays with pre-dawn lights. I wake, drink coffee, leave. A grail nods in each daffodil. Pale stars along my walk as I shake sleep. Class is 4 minutes from the dorm. We read, to sleep, perchance to dream. Remember fragments of a dream that slipped beneath the fairy lights while we were reading in the dorm. Then read how Spencer sought the Grail, how Milton drank it in his sleep, and Chaucer's daffodils were stars who loved the earth too well. But stars, say cafe philosophes, are a dream espresso solves. They outrun sleep beneath the scales of plastic lights. No one has ever seen the Grail, they say, and cry back in their dorm. Owens Hall used to be a dorm. Professors now hang stained glass stars on dusty shelves there, by the Grail. They linger down and dream beneath the dull fluorescent lights, but lingering, they do not sleep. And in that dorm I sometimes dream of bright stars peering from the lights. The Grail spills down and breaks my sleep.
Beautiful, Sarah. Beautiful. Remembering fragments of a dream. Remembering, here, I'm just plugging this in. You know, it's a good poem when there are lines that you want to remember. And I always have that feeling, at least viscerally, with many of the poems I've read from you recently, Sarah. So are you writing regularly these days, or you're working?
Well, both. I only teach part-time, and we're on a university sort of a schedule, so I teach Mondays and Wednesdays and every other Friday, which frees up my Tuesdays and Thursdays and sometimes a long weekend for writing and reading. Mostly I'm trying to read right now, because there's so much out there, and I'm 24 and I feel like I have these great piles of books lying around my house, taunting me, lovingly taunting me. And I'm trying to make my way through them. But yes, I do write pretty regularly, as well.
And you got that Fireside right behind you, which is perfect.
I do. We have our TV set up there. One of my, I'm not a mom, but one of my little crunchy mom quirks, latent crunchy mom quirks, I guess, is that I don't want the television to be the focal point of the house, and yet we bring it out, to watch something like the Wives and Daughters adaptation I'm obsessed with right now. And then it sits there the focal point of the house, and I'm such a little hypocrite.
Right.
Yeah, we've been having that. We're doing a slow move south, and so the same question of the TV in the living room has been a big that's probably been the single biggest topic of conversation.
Where do we put the TV? I don't have a TV. People hate me when I say it's like, oh, you
We're
think.
on the same page, actually. I don't know.
Sorry?
Like we're on the same page. I don't know. I have a TV. It's too
I have
much.
2 computers. So yeah, I should confess that. So yeah. But guys, I think I don't want to keep you here all afternoon. We've covered a fair amount of ground, and I mean, there's still a lot that we could discuss. We just talked about when we were talking about Petrarch, we got into the translation question, but I think the points you made about Petrarch being a Renaissance vanguard and engaging with tradition, right? I think he's a good model for tradition doesn't preclude reform or developing or refining a vernacular, right? I think the same challenges exist right now. So it is going to be interesting to see these translations and what you've come up with, but also I think, yeah, it's worthwhile to meditate on this question of engaging tradition and how one does that in a creative way that actually breathes new life into the whole thing, rather than just having this, I guess, more kind of formalistic idea of recreating some past moment. If we recognize that doesn't happen, that can be liberating because it opens up new possibilities. And so we could go into these things for a while, but maybe we could begin to wrap it up. You know, if people have announcements or things that they're doing, for example, is brought to my attention, we mentioned the Frost Farm Poetry Prize. Is there not a Frost Farm event on the horizon, and are not some folks going to be there? Several people brought this up to me, and
yeah, it's an annual. It's moved around a little bit in terms of the date, but it's usually in August, and it's a wonderful event. It's very intimate because the footprint of the Frost Farm can't allow more than about 50 people.
okay.
And when I used to teach there, I mean, it was great because I would literally sit in an old rocking chair of Robert Frost in his kitchen next to his potbelly stove when I was doing the discussions with the students. So it's a wonderful place to visit. They always have a great faculty.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yes, it's coming up in August, I believe. And Zena and Elijah from, I think the last discussion will both be there. I think Elijah's leading a class, unless I've gotten him mixed up with someone else.
Yeah, no, they're the ones who mentioned it. And I just bring it up because, again, we're having a virtual conversation, but I think that it's important to keep in mind that it's good to know about in-person poetry events, and that hopefully we'll be seeing a lot more of this kind of thing. We have some projects in the work here at the Chained Muse. You know, there's always no shortage of conspiracies, I guess. You know, you have to be on your feet here. How to electrify live poetry events and, you know, create a new kind of poetry Hollywood. What does that mean? You know, audiovisual productions and shows. I mean, it would be cool if some of these, the Fireside gatherings, we're going to have to do that in person at some point. So it's, and I believe Benjamin Franklin, back in the good old days of the American Revolution, they had committees of correspondence, right? So there, groups would get together, but they would correspond. And, there was an in-person aspect, and there was a, by mail back then, but telecommunications. So yeah, I think the interplay between the two opens up a lot of possibilities. And so the demons of technology.
Franklin was a pretty good poet himself too. He wrote light verse.
I know he was a funny guy, so I'm not surprised to hear that.
Yeah, I did a short essay on it for Light magazine about almost 15 years ago.
Oh, that's cool. This is one of the things, yeah. So we're going to link to people's stuff here. So people, if they have specific things they want me to link to after the conversation, we'll include them. And once that's up, yeah, so I will thank everybody for joining us. There's a lot coming up. Everybody's got projects as well. So I think it's very useful for people to know what's out there, what to expect. And yeah, Frost Farm poetry, that's something that people are going to. And if people want to organize other events in their parts of, I mean, North America is pretty big. That's the one challenge we have. So thank God for technology, but hosting poetry events, I'm sure some people may have some ideas about how that could be executed, and have poetry committees of correspondence of sorts, if you will. So I thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me and for pairing me with these two who I'm big fans of. Yeah, I blurbed Michael's book, and I picked Sarah for the Frost Farm prize. So these are two folks with great futures ahead of them.
Absolutely. Amen. And so, yes, if people haven't gotten Michael Shindler's book, Michael, your book is?
It's Fret Not from Finishing Line Press. This is what it looks like. Buy a copy today.
We love a shameless plug. Amen. I'm going to do one myself as well, because we are getting ready to put out the 7th issue of New Lyre. Every journal is its own timeless journey. So if people are not caught up, they should get caught up, because we have an Egypt issue coming out, theme that's not going away. So yeah, people stay tuned for all that. Sarah, what should we be looking out for?
For me to have a nice, calm summer minding my own business. I'm very looking forward to it.
And her poems in the coming issue of New Lyre, so they can look forward to that.
That too, I guess. I'm ready to sleep in for many days.
Amen. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for watching, and we'll be back again shortly.